Once upon a time, when coastlines were still argued over, and the sea was treated as something alive rather than measured, there was a stretch of water known as Blackwater Bay. It did not appear unusual on early charts. Its danger was not marked with symbols or warnings. Yet sailors of the early 18th century knew better than to linger there. They spoke of the bay in lowered voices, as if naming it too loudly might draw attention. I did not hear these stories firsthand. None of us did. What remains comes from dock records, ship registries, and a bundle of handwritten testimonies discovered long after the fact, sealed in a maritime archive and stamped unresolved. The ink had faded. The paper smelled faintly of salt. Someone had tried very hard to forget what happened there in the year 1723. Blackwater Bay lay along a jagged curve of coast where the water darkened abruptly, even on clear mornings. The tide moved strangely there, slower on the surface, stronger beneath. Fishermen complained that their nets sank too deep and returned tangled, heavy with nothing inside. Anchors dropped in the bay struck bottom too quickly and came up warm, as if drawn across stone rather than sand. On the morning of June 9, 1723, a lookout stationed near the cliffs spotted a ship drifting toward the bay. It approached without urgency, carried by a gentle tide, its sails hanging loose and unmanned. From a distance, it looked intact. No torn canvas, no broken mast, no sign of distress. The vessel did not signal. By midday, it had crossed fully into the bay and slowed, turning slightly as though guided rather than abandoned. Those watching from shore noted how quietly it moved. No creaking hull, no snapping rope. The water around it lay flat and dark. The ship was identified later that afternoon as the Vesper, a merchant brig that had departed nearly a month earlier with a full crew of 21 men. It had been loaded with spices, timber, and cloth, bound for a northern trade route it had sailed before, without incident. The captain was experienced. The weather had been favorable. There was no reason for the ship to be where it was. A small party was sent out to board it. 6 men rowed across the bay, calling out as they approached. Their voices sounded thin, strangely unfinished, as though the air swallowed them before they reached the deck. No answer came back. When they climbed aboard, the silence deepened. The deck showed signs of recent use. Rope lay coiled near the mast. Buckets sat by the rail. A lantern rested against the wheel, unlit but recently handled. The wheel itself was secured straight, tied off carefully, not abandoned in haste. There were no men. Below deck, the air was warm, uncomfortably so. One of the boarders later wrote that it felt like stepping into a body rather than a ship. The hold was full, cargo untouched, crates unbroken, barrels sealed, nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. In the galley, a meal had been prepared and left unfinished. Dried fish lay half-cut on a board. Cups stood where they had been set down. The stove was cold, but the metal beneath it retained heat longer than expected. They searched the sleeping quarters next. Hammocks hung neatly, some still swaying faintly despite the stillness of the bay. Boots lined the walls. Personal effects remained: letters, coins, a carved wooden charm tucked beside a bunk. No blood, no damage, no signs of struggle. It was as if the crew had stepped away all at once and never returned. The ship's log was found in the captain's cabin. The final entry was dated 3 days before the vessel should have reached its destination. It mentioned nothing unusual: wind steady, crew healthy, progress acceptable. The handwriting was calm, deliberate. There was no final note, no explanation. The men grew uneasy the longer they remained aboard. Several later testified to the same sensation. When standing still, they felt a faint vibration beneath their feet. Not the movement of water, something slower, measured, rhythmic, like pressure being released and reapplied. By evening, the Vesper was towed closer to shore and anchored within the bay under watch. News spread quickly, though details were scarce. People gathered along the cliffs at dusk, lanterns flickering as they stared at the ship's dark outline against darker water. That night, the bay did not sound as it should have. The tide moved without splash. Wind passed without whistle. Watchmen stationed along the shore reported hearing a low, distant noise just after midnight. Not a voice, not a call, but something deep and collective, like a weight shifting beneath the water. The next morning, officials began a formal investigation. The ship was searched again, more thoroughly. A physician examined the interior, searching for signs of illness or poisoning. He found none. However, in his report, he noted something unusual. The lowest timbers of the hull were warm to the touch, particularly near the keel. He suggested prolonged exposure to heat, though no source could be identified. On the third day, markings were discovered along the inner hull, just below the waterline. They were not scratches or gouges. They were smooth impressions, evenly spaced, shallow and worn, as if something had rested against the wood repeatedly. The surrounding timber was darker, saturated from within, rather than without. No one could explain how they had formed. That night, one of the watchmen abandoned his post. He later claimed that while standing near the anchored ship, he felt pressure in his chest, as though the air itself resisted his breath. He swore he heard movement beneath the hull, slow and deliberate, as if something massive were adjusting its position below the surface. By the end of the week, Blackwater Bay was closed to traffic. Orders were issued quietly. Ships were rerouted. The fate of the Vesper was left deliberately vague in official records. Some accounts claim it was scuttled beyond the bay. Others suggest it was never moved at all. What is certain is that Blackwater Bay was never the same afterward, and neither was the sea. In the years that followed, Blackwater Bay acquired a reputation that maps could not erase. Sailors avoided it even when detours cost them weeks. Those forced to pass near its mouth described the same unease, compasses wavering, clocks losing time, and the sense of being observed from below the surface. Officially, nothing more was ever found. Unofficially, fragments kept surfacing, too many to dismiss. The fate of the Vesper was the first thing deliberately obscured. The ship was removed under cover of night, not dismantled in port as protocol demanded. Records claim it was towed out beyond the bay and sunk in deep water, yet no coordinates were ever recorded. No witness testimony aligns. One harbor clerk later admitted, in a letter never sent, that the ship resisted movement, as if the water itself thickened around its hull. He described ropes going slack without reason, and men losing their footing on a calm sea. Within a month of its discovery, the men who boarded the Vesper began to change. The first was Elias Ward, one of the rowers. He complained of pressure headaches and an unshakable warmth beneath his feet, even indoors. He refused to sleep near the coast. Neighbors said he paced at night, stopping suddenly as if listening. When questioned, he claimed he could hear something moving slowly through the ground, always toward the bay. He disappeared 6 weeks after the ship was found. His bed was still warm. Others followed, not vanishing outright, but unraveling. A watch officer began writing symbols in the margins of his logbooks, repeating curved shapes that resembled the impressions found along the Vesper's hull. He claimed they came to him in dreams, drawn by hands that were not his own. When ordered to stop, he burned the books and requested reassignment inland. The physician who examined the ship resigned his post entirely. In a final report, sealed and marked inadvisable for public circulation. He described a theory he could not support with reason. He suggested that the crew of the Vesper had not died aboard the ship, nor fled it, but had been relieved of their weight, as though the sea itself had decided they were no longer required. The bay, he wrote, behaved as a container rather than a body of water. That phrase appears nowhere else. What little we know next comes from correspondence between maritime officials and a natural philosopher named Thomas Hale, summoned quietly to assess Blackwater Bay. Hale arrived late in the autumn of 1723. His journals survived because he sent copies inland before returning to the coast. He described the bay as acoustically wrong. Sound failed to travel properly, collapsing inward rather than outward. He noted that dropped objects struck the water without echo, and that even loud calls seemed to shorten before completion. Hale believed the bay exerted pressure not only on bodies, but on intention itself. On his third night, he anchored a small vessel near the center of the bay and recorded measurements until after midnight. At precisely the same hour each night, the water beneath his boat warmed noticeably, not gradually, suddenly, as if something below adjusted its proximity. Hale did not return to shore after that night. His boat was found adrift the following morning, empty but intact. The lantern was still lit. The journal ended mid-sentence, the final words trailing downward across the page, as though the paper had been tilted suddenly. Authorities halted the investigation soon after. Blackwater Bay was officially deemed unstable for navigation, though no cause was listed. Patrols were withdrawn. Coastal settlements nearby reported fewer ships passing each year. By the mid-1700s, the bay was rarely mentioned at all. Yet the sea does not forget. In the decades that followed, ships occasionally reported sightings. An unmanned brig drifting at dawn, sails slack, hull unmarked, always at a distance, always silent. No ship ever approached closely enough to confirm its identity. None were ever recovered. Local legends began to circulate, though none matched the records precisely. Fishermen claimed the bay fed on movement, not flesh, that it took those who lingered, those who waited. Others spoke of weight being the key, of the sea growing impatient with what burdened it. One account, dated 1761, describes a storm that never reached shore. Witnesses watched clouds coil over the bay, darkening the water until it matched the sky. Thunder rolled without lightning. At the center of the bay, the water bulged upward slightly, as if something vast shifted beneath the surface. Nothing broke through. By the 19th century, Blackwater Bay had faded into obscurity. Maps simplified its shape. Records condensed its history into footnotes. It became a place sailors avoided without remembering why. The final document in the archive, the one that prompted renewed interest centuries later, is a ledger entry dated 1802. It notes a survey attempt ordered by a coastal development council. 3 men were sent to chart the bay's depths using weighted lines. Only the boat returned. The weights were missing. The accompanying note, written in a different hand, reads simply, "Depth unrecordable. Bay exhibits resistance." Today, Blackwater Bay appears calm. Tourists pass nearby without noticing anything amiss. The water reflects the sky. Birds fly overhead. Nothing stirs the surface. But those who stand quietly at its edge sometimes report a peculiar sensation. A faint warmth rising through their boots, a pressure behind the ribs, and the feeling that if they remain still long enough, something beneath the water will notice the balance has shifted and begin correcting it. Because the Vesper was not the first ship to enter Blackwater Bay without returning. It was simply the last one we documented before learning to look away.